and soon lost, is illustrated by 6 nude co-eds doing an 8-minute modern dance to Iron Butterflies in a Gata Davida under some very trippy light show. Complications arise. And finally, in the aftermath of Dow, the city yearns to learn what's going on campus. Here's one form of many from March 21st, 1968, featuring history grad student Paul Soglin and attorney William Dyke. It is the shape of things to come. But that story is for another night. Now is the time for me to close the reading and invite your questions and comments, not just about 1968, but about the entire decade. And again, thank you very much for coming. We don't have a mic, so just raise your hands, and if anybody's got a question or comment, now would be the time. Nobody's good. Yes, Mr. Fish.
Stuart, what surprised you the most in your research?
The degree of intense great question. The degree of intense public participation in events. In 1960, there are 126,000 people living in Madison. 1,000 come to the public hearing for Monona Terrace. That's as if we had a city council meeting today and filled Overture Hall. Because we've doubled the city. So 1,000 people at that. During the draft sit-in protest, there's a big gathering on the Hill that Harrington and Fleming spoke to. 8,000 people sitting on the Hill. So the number of people who are participating, there's a school board hearing in 1969 over the budget. 500 people coming to a school board hearing. That level of public involvement and public participation is really staggering. And you sort of juxtapose that to the way individuals on campus can direct demonstrations, can generate activity, can make something happen. The way Evan Stark or Bob Cohen or this is pre-Soglin, but how individuals can generate something happening. How Hank Haslick and a couple of SDS guys can go, hey, let's take over the administration building, and boom, they go in and take over the administration building. So there's, on one level, you've got this mass public participation. On the other level, you've got individuals being able to make things happening. And that I found really interesting. The degree to which I thought Henry Reynolds was a good mayor, I found interesting. I think people will find Henry Reynolds comes off, people who know that I am of a progressive bent, I think will find it surprising how well Henry Reynolds comes off. And maybe not how well Otto comes off. But so that was surprising as well. Yeah?
How do you say that the Sterling Hall explosion happened during this time? I went to school at this, I was at the school at the university when this happened.
Well, remember the part in the introduction where I said the book ends on December 31st, 1969? That's August 70, that's, as we say, outside my field. Although I do have Carl Arms, at the very end of 1969, we get what's going to lead into Army Math. The story of Army Math starts happening in early 1969 with Jim Rowan's articles in the Daily Cardinal exposing the activities that are going on in Army Math, and people are really focusing, and it's becoming an issue. So that when the explosion happens, people automatically think, oh, that was Army Math. It's a continuation of what happens starting in '69 with the attacks on the Secret Service, on the Selective Service offices, and the attacks on the ROTC building, and the New Year's gang. So in terms of the protest, my last protest action is the failed bombing of the Badger ammo plant, and Carl and Dwight driving back into town, and it's sort of a curtain raiser, but I don't go into Army Math in any detail. But it's hanging in the balance. Jonathan?
I'm struck by your comments about the hundreds of people who turned out for school board meetings and council meetings. The juxtaposition of that and the fact that Monona Terrace was approved in lightning speed, you know, that that strikes me as so opposite of the way things work today.
That's why I read that part with italics. So I'm glad that point came through. Yeah, they approved that design the day after it was presented. That's incomprehensible to us today. Somewhere in between those two, there's a happy medium. But yeah, that came through very, very clearly to me as well. That things happened. One of the things that I think the book accomplishes is it shows the trajectory of developments, and especially in the urban renewal area. And I didn't go into urban renewal in this talk because not much happens in urban renewal in 1968. But in 1960 and 61 and 62, it is the dominant story. The two dominant stories in 60, 61, 62, 63 are urban renewal and civil rights. And I think the story I tell of urban renewal will, well, I know there's material here that nobody's ever seen before because I went into the federal files and got correspondence, and I think it will round out people's understanding of urban renewal. But the arc of development, how something, you see something proposed in 1963, and okay, it finally gets approved in 1968. So that degree of things hasn't changed, but sometimes they move with lightning speed. To approve something the day after it's presented is incomprehensible to us. Steve?
Given your perspective from Plan Commission, you see decisions about development, like with East Town, West Town, or whatever, that were made in the 60s that we're either benefiting from now or paying for now, 50 years later.
I thought you were going to ask a process question. Well, I see things that thankfully weren't built. In 1964, there was one of the really interesting characters is Gerald Bartell. We all know Jeffrey Bartell and Nick and Chad and Angela. Gerald Bartell was a major developer in the 1960s. He's in the Wisconsin Broadcaster Hall of Fame. Very interesting, very accomplished guy. But in 1964, he and his partner, Robert Brooks, had a proposal to build an 800-car parking ramp and retail operation where the concourse is today. And if you think of the dominoes that would have created, if there's no concourse there, I mean, it creates lots of dominoes. So thankfully that wasn't built. But the other thing they proposed was a 10-story Holiday Inn on Lisa Link Peace Park, where Victor Music burned down in 1960. By 1964, it was still vacant. Bartell and Brooks proposed a Holiday Inn. And just think how that destroys State Street. The whole concept of State Street is destroyed if that happens. That's not built. So a number of projects that weren't built are the bullets we dodge. And the fact that Monona Terrace and Monona Basin were not built turned out to have been a good thing. The other thing about development at the time was, remember, we've got essentially an all-white, all-male city government. We've got one woman member of the Common Council, Ethel Brown, in the early part of the decade, and then Allie Ashman gets elected in 1968. But people today don't understand the revolution. I refer to Election Day earthquakes. The revolution that started in 1968 fundamentally transformed the nature of Madison city government, and it was really only fully developed once Paul Soglin was elected mayor in 1973. But you had an all-white, all-male, all middle-aged, middle-class city council up until 1968, when Allie Ashman and Paul Soglin get elected. Gene Parks gets elected in 1969, and now we start to see a modern city council. But and there may be some connection between the alacrity with which people approve things and the sameness of which they're all looking at it through the same lens. So that's what I got to say about planning and development. She and then Lizzie. Yes.
So you began to talk about this a little bit, but think about civil rights, urban renewal, and the destruction of the green bush.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was on campus and missed it all
Yes. Yeah.
because we were insulated.
Right. It's just my sense that people who were so involved in, well, on campus, civil rights was always very big. In the early, I mean, we've got, you know, the first demonstration is picketing, is a informational picket outside Woolworth's on the square 28 days after the sit-ins in North Carolina. So that started very quickly. It's the Socialist Club and the New Left people, you know, it's all William Appleman Williams students, you know, and civil rights is...
Also, like, only 100 black students on campus.
Oh, fewer, and there were 20 from Wisconsin, most of them were African.
And most of them were male. not
Yeah. But so civil rights is a big deal all through the early parts of the day, early parts. Jeff Greenfield, who was the editor of the Daily Cardinal at the time, got death threats when he went after the fraternities and sororities because they were, let's say, lagging on civil rights activities. So the civil rights story on campus is profound and very important, but people were totally oblivious to what's going on in the bush. They're totally oblivious to everything that's going on the other side of the tracks. Leslie.
So I know you read almost everything that was printed in the 60s. So I'm just wondering, outside of the Cardinal, did you run across any reporters, editors, columnists who you would like to be more widely known because they were good?
Well, let me sort of pivot off that and just say a bit about the research.
Yeah.
I read every day's newspaper for the State Journal, the Capital Times, and the Daily Cardinal for 10 years. That's a lot of daily newspapers. And then the Badger Herald comes in for the last 3 months in 1969. Then I went to the archives, the University Archives and the State Historical Society Archives, and went into the Redevelopment Authority files, went into the Techopera files, went into, and then go to Harrington's files and Sewell files. I got to say, the level of journalism of the era was of such a high level, and I say that not because Marv and my former colleague from the Cap Times, Phil Hasslinger, are here, but the level of journalism and the depth and the breadth of it. You know, it's like a 20-inch story on what the Plan Commission is going to do tonight, and 25 inches on what the Board of Estimates did, and the detail and the analysis is so impressive. And, you know, there are a couple of stories where if it's a Monona Terrace story, I know both papers are going to bring a bias. They're both unreliable on Monona Terrace. On the war, you know, but when it's just normal city politics, they're both so good. And the Daily Cardinal, my goodness, in addition to Marv, we've got Jeff Greenfield, we've got Walt Bogdanich, we've got Lowell Bergman, we've got just a number of people, Whitney Gould, and on. Paul Soglin was a columnist. So the level of journalism I was reading, excuse me, was just of the highest order. And I really fear that nobody will be able to write this book of this decade because the raw material, the source material, will not exist. You get blog posts, you get tweets, you get short stories. I've got 34,000 digital clippings because this was great. The first book, the Sesquicentennial book, I've got 35 3-ring binders of photocopies. This book, man, I've got thumb drives, man. And what I did was I would come down to the Madison Public Library, and we actually made an arrangement where we you know, and I'd go into the local government room, and maybe I'd go get a pastry from the corner, and I'd sit there all day, and I'd just go page by page, and I'd scan items and take them home and, you know, index them, and I'd listen to WORT or, you know, some Grateful Dead, and I'd file and everything, and the material for this decade won't exist. So I was very lucky in the source material that I got to do. We got time for a couple more? Anybody else? I mean, come on, I had more material, yeah.
What was the role of, I'm sorry, what's the role of women, you know, in this period? You know, feminism kind of was more in the 70s and so the late 60s. How involved were women in the protest movement? You know?
Not very.
Yeah.
The first active role of women in the anti-war protest is that freshman ROTC resistance that I mentioned in 1968, where one of the demonstrations was women going into the naval ROTC and creating a ruckus and disrupting the class. And at one point, there's a woman from Great Neck who, according to the newspaper, says, Naomi Curry of Great Neck says she wants to develop what's called a, in quote, women's liberation movement to address things like abortion and birth control and so on. But the New Left was not a feminist movement, to put it mildly. And it was a very sexist movement. So there's very little, this is largely a book driven by middle-aged, middle-class white men. But there are a couple of women superstars. Shirley Abrahamson is a star in this book. Shirley Abrahamson wrote the Madison Equal Opportunities Ordinance. And I got a picture, those of you who have the book, 1963 Man, there's a picture of Shirley Abrahamson walking her 2 Irish setters. It's a really cute picture. So I got Shirley Abrahamson. Allie Ashman is important. Ethel Brown comes up with a compromise. Eve Galanter's predecessor from the University Heights district on the city council. Ethel Brown is a very important member of the city council, crafting the compromise that gets the first fair housing code passed. Mitch Miller becomes important in 1968 with the McCarthy campaign, and then gets elected to the legislature in 1970. So we introduce Midge in 1968, but she really becomes important a few years later. Kay Clarenbach, I've certainly got Kay Clarenbach in the book as one of the co-founders of NOW. In fact, I've got a picture of Kay Clarenbach and Joyce Martell and Dixie Chappelle. But the women are identifiable as important individuals who did things, as opposed to women as a general movement. That happens a few years out of my time zone. Yes?
I was going to ask, you mentioned a murder of that.
Oh yeah, Christine Rothschild. Oh my God, what a tragic story. A fetishistic murder. She was not sexually assaulted, but oh my goodness, her gloves were jammed down her throat. Let me just say it was a fetishistic murder. On campus, the body dumped by Science Hall. No arrests were ever made. There was a book a few years ago that Nancy, that what did I say?
Science, Sterling Hall.
Sterling Hall.
Yeah, Sterling.
No, it was Sterling House. Yeah. There's a book that pretty conclusively demonstrated there was a guy named Niels Jorgensen who was a very twisted doctor who worked in the hospital across the street from where Christine worked, who had been stalking her and watching her sleep, but they didn't know that at the time, so there were no arrests made. It's a terrible story, and that was Christine Rothschild. She was a first-year woman, lived in Ann Emery Hall, used to go on walkabouts in the morning, and this guy was just laying in wait for her. It's a very sad story. Yeah.
Just a process question. So between the time that you concepted, I think I might write a book about this, to the time that you delivered a draft to the consultant, it's like, how long did this take you? All the time drafts.
The question was a process, how long did the book take to research and write, essentially? I retired from the state job in April 2015. I started work immediately. It was about probably a year and a half of just straight research, then maybe a year of writing, and then 6 to 8 months of me and Liz going back and forth with, here's the draft, here's your corrected draft, no, here's my comments and your comments, here's my comment. And then after we agree on the draft, then after we sign off, then it goes to the copy editors. God bless the copy editors who found mistake. No, so if there had been fewer mistakes, we would have had the book sooner. But the copy editor found the mistakes, and then we have layout discussions, and the books arrive yesterday. So essentially, it's a 3-day process. But I have to say, it was the most fun. It was the most fun. The research, just to sit there and what will I learn today? What that I didn't know am I about to find out? When I turned, because the book is written as it was lived. It's written chronologically in the present tense, because people don't know what's coming next. And when you open, February 1962, you don't know what's coming. It's like, whoa! And the process of learning something, and then, okay, now that I know this, how does it fit into the larger scheme? What are the really interesting stories? Oh, the amount of stuff I wrote and just had to cut for space. I mean, the book is 20,000 words longer than we thought it was going to be, but there's another 30,000 on the floor somewhere at home. But just that whole process, I loved every minute. It was so much fun. And it's just a great opportunity to get to share it with people. And I'm so thankful that people came out to see this. I think we got time for one more quick one, if there's, and then we'll go and maybe people want to buy books. But if we got one more quick question, yes.
How did you decide what to keep and what to let go?
I used to be a newspaper reporter, and I just said, okay, what is interesting and important? If something is interesting and not important, it's level B. If something is important but not interesting, okay, that's my challenge as a writer, to make it interesting. Because if it's important, it should be in there. So the first level was, is it important? So I had a lot of crime and disorder stories that were like really interesting stories, but it's like, okay, this doesn't tell us anything about Madison. This isn't important. It's interesting, but not important. So you start with what's important, and then you do your best as a writer to make it interesting while still being true and being honest and being accurate. So, I mean, that's the hierarchy. Accurate, important, interesting. And then if you've got good art, that makes it even better. But that's the hierarchy. And one more quick one, and then I love talking to people. Yeah, very good job.
You talked about lots of things that Madison didn't do. Fortunately, didn't build it. What did Madison build in the '60s that they got right? Anything?
The causeway. The causeway, and the causeway was Henry Reynolds pushing it through, because Phil, the Capital Times, went to the ends of the earth to block Monona Causeway, because the Cap Times thought Monona Causeway was the backdoor way to build the Civic Center and the auditorium at Olin Park, because you couldn't have, they were convinced that the only reason to build Monona Causeway was to kill Monona Terrace. And Cap Times fought the hammer and tong against Monona Causeway. Henry Reynolds pushed it through, and that was a really good thing. So that's the good thing that the city did in 1967. And again, that was Henry Reynolds. That's part of why I thought Henry Reynolds comes off very well in the book. On that note, it's 6:31. Thank you all for coming. Hi, Judith. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Well, it's pretty evident that, one person doing all this work is not supported. I know what the publication is about. It's his let's sleep tomorrow night. Just no, let's go. That's get a book.
We're just hoping for the
Does he have a take?
Stephen's like, feel free to bring
Do you have like notices all over?